Welcome. Wherever you are, whether your mind is racing or your body is weary, know this moment is meant for peace. Tonight's story is not one of grand battles or kings in their glory. It's not a story of thunder or fire or vast miracles in front of crowds. Instead, it's the story of a woman, poor, overlooked, burdened, who meets God in her emptiness. It's the story of a quiet house, of a little oil, of jars borrowed from neighbors, and of how heaven can fill the most ordinary spaces. This is the story of Elisha and the widow's oil, 2 Kings 4. And as you listen, may the simplicity of this miracle remind you that God sees you, especially in your lack, especially in your silence. You don't have to be powerful to be provided for. You don't have to be seen by the world to be seen by God. Settle in now. Let your shoulders drop. Let your thoughts begin to quiet. Because the same God who filled jars in a quiet home in Israel is the same God who stays near tonight. It was early morning when the widow stepped out of her house. The air was still. The sun had not yet risen high, but already the weight of the day pressed against her chest. She was tired. Not just from the heat or the walking, but from the worry. Her husband was gone, and the debts he had left behind had only grown heavier in his absence. Now, collectors came not just for coins, but for her sons. They demanded what she could not give, and if she could not pay, they would take the only family she had left. She pressed her hands to her chest and tried not to cry aloud. There had been enough crying in the house. Her sons needed strength, not sobs. But inside her, fear gnawed and scratched. What would become of them? What future was there for a woman with no income, no voice in society, no man to shield her from the weight of the world? But then, a memory stirred. A name. A prophet. Not just any prophet, one who had been close to her husband. Elisha. She had heard the stories. How he had inherited the mantle of Elijah. How he walked in power. How he spoke with authority. But also how he listened. And so, with trembling hope, she made her way through the dusty streets to find him. She found Elisha near the gates, among the people. He was not lofty, not unreachable. And when she called to him, he turned and gave her his full attention. "My husband, your servant, is dead," she said, voice cracking. "You know that he revered the Lord. But now his creditor is coming to take my 2 boys as his slaves." There was no accusation in her tone. Just grief. Desperation. A quiet pleading beneath her words, "Please. Help us." Elisha looked at her with compassion. He did not dismiss her pain or try to offer quick comfort. Instead, he asked a question. A gentle one. One that reached past her fear and into her reality. "What do you have in your house?" She paused. Confused. Did it matter? What could she possibly have that was worth anything? "I have nothing there at all," she replied, and then, almost as an afterthought, "except a small jar of olive oil. Just a little oil. Not a barrel. Not a vat. Just a jar. Insignificant. Ordinary." But Elisha nodded as if she had spoken the answer to a riddle. "That jar would be enough. Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars," he said. "Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut the door behind you and your sons. Pour oil into all the jars, and as each is filled, put it to one side." The widow blinked. "Collect jars? Pour oil? From this?" But she had come asking for help, and help was given. Strange help. But clear. Specific. Hopeful. She hurried home, heart pounding not just with fear now, but with something else. Possibility. The widow stepped back into her home and quickly gathered her sons. Her heart raced. Her hands trembled. And her voice, though still quiet, had a new kind of urgency. "We need to go," she said. To the neighbors. "Quickly. We need empty jars." The boys looked at her, confused. "Why?" "There's no time to explain. Just ask everyone. Any size. Any shape. Bring what you can carry. As many as they will give." The sons, obedient, eager, ran into the dusty street, knocking on doors. Their neighbors, surprised but curious, began handing over what they had. 1 jar. 2. Then 5. Then 10. Some offered questions. Others, only puzzled glances. But most gave willingly, passing over worn vessels that had long been emptied of oil, grain, or wine. Some were cracked, others stained by years of use. But none were turned away. The boys returned over and over again, arms full. Soon, the widow's home was dotted with pottery. Large and small. Round and narrow. Every surface held a jar. The floor was crowded. The corners filled. And yet, the little jar that had been sitting on her shelf remained unchanged. Still small. Still ordinary. Still hers. She closed the door behind her. Just as Elisha had said. And for a moment, the house went quiet. The 2 boys looked at her, expectant. She held the small jar of oil in her hands, heart pounding louder than the silence. This was it. She lifted the jar, walked to the first vessel, and began to pour. Oil slipped from the lip of the jar and flowed down. Slowly at first. Then steadily. It filled the bottom. Then climbed upward. The boy holding the vessel looked down, then back at his mother, eyes wide. "It's full." She nodded. Barely breathing. "Bring me another." And another was placed in front of her. She poured again. The oil flowed. Smooth. Steady. Silent. Then another. And another. Each time she poured, the oil kept coming. And still her original jar, the one she had thought almost empty, never ran dry. In the hush of their home, a miracle unfolded. No lightning struck. No thunder cracked. No voice shouted from the heavens. Just oil. Simple. Sacred. Unstopping. The boys moved quickly, placing jars in front of her, one after the next. And the widow, once too weary to hope, now stood straight. Pouring. 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 Until the last jar stood before her. The final vessel. The last offering of space. And as the final drop settled inside, she lowered her jar. And the flow stopped. Not before. Not after. Exactly when the last jar was filled. No more, no less. She stared down at the quiet room, heart racing. Not a single drop had been wasted. Not a single jar was left empty. She set the original jar down. The same small jar. The one she had almost dismissed. She had not gained a new source. She had only used what she already had. And it had been enough. The house was quiet again. But this time, not with sorrow. The air was still, yet full of something invisible. Not fear. Not desperation. But reverence. The kind of silence that follows a holy thing. The widow looked around at the jars. She ran her fingers along the smooth curves of each one. They were full. Each vessel, once empty, once borrowed, now held oil. Precious. Usable. Valuable. The same neighbors who had lent their vessels would recognize that value. The town would know. She, the poor widow, now held something priceless. And yet, it hadn't come from wealth or work. It had come through obedience. And faith. She could have laughed at Elisha. She could have refused, but she hadn't. And now the evidence of her obedience stood in quiet rows all around her. Without hesitation, she left the house and returned to the prophet. She didn't wait for ceremony. She didn't prepare a speech. She simply came and spoke from her heart. "I did what you said," she told Elisha. "I poured from the jar. And now all the vessels are full." Elisha looked at her and smiled. Not surprised. Not awed. He had known. And then he gave her one more instruction. "Go," he said. "Sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left." It was so simple. So matter-of-fact. But to the widow, it was everything. Her sons, no longer in danger of slavery. Her future, no longer tethered to fear. And beyond her debts, there would be enough to live on. Not just survive, but live. God had not only met her at her lowest, he had lifted her up. Not just out of desperation, but into dignity. She returned home, heart bursting. The same home that had once held only a dying hope, now overflowed with provision. She began to sell the oil. Neighbor by neighbor. Jar by jar. And with each exchange, she paid off what was owed. Bit by bit, the chains of debt were broken. And her son stood free. What had begun as a plea for rescue had become a story of restoration. God hadn't just given her a solution. He had transformed her life. And it all began with what she thought was nothing. A small jar. A forgotten corner of the shelf. A bit of oil. But in God's hands, it was more than enough. There is something sacred about the way God moves in quiet places. He doesn't always split seas or call fire from the sky. Sometimes, he simply multiplies oil in a home no one else sees. Sometimes, he begins with a widow's cry and ends with jars too full to carry. In this story, there were no trumpets. No thundering voice from the heavens. Just a woman with debt. A home full of silence. A jar of oil. And a choice. She could have held back. She could have looked at her jar, then at her sons, and said, "It's not enough." She could have laughed at the prophet's instruction. But she didn't. She obeyed. She poured. And in the pouring, the miracle came. A God who fills what is empty. God didn't ask for something she didn't have. He began with what she already possessed. It wasn't about the oil. It was about trust. About obedience. About space. The miracle didn't run until the widow stopped pouring. It stopped when there were no more vessels. When there was no more room. That's a truth worth remembering. God will always fill what we make room for. And sometimes, the only thing standing between emptiness and overflow is obedience. She didn't create the miracle. She didn't control the outcome. She simply did what God asked, and God did the rest. The ones we overlook. It's easy to skip past stories like this. There are no kings. No armies. No prophets calling down fire. Just a woman. A mother. Grieving. Afraid. Forgotten by most, but not forgotten by God. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's in these quieter stories that we learn who God really is. He is not just the God of crowds and thunder. He is the God of small kitchens. Of unpaid debts. Of weary hearts. Of borrowed jars. He sees the widow. The single parent. The overlooked worker. The one who thinks their offering is too small to matter. And he says, "Bring me what you have. I will fill it." So tonight, let this story be a blanket over your thoughts. Let it calm the storms that rattle around your mind. You don't need to have more. You don't need to be more. What you have, even if it seems small, is enough in His hands. Whether you feel like the widow, exhausted and unsure, or like her sons, carrying heavy things you don't understand, or even like one of the empty jars, waiting quietly, hoping to be filled. Remember, God sees, God hears, God fills, and He has not forgotten you. Rest now. You don't need all the answers tonight. You only need to bring what you have. Sleep peacefully. The God of the oil jar is still the God who stays.